of the Institute. It's a great opportunity to be here and an honor. Jason Claunch and I made the trip up here because we really do believe that this is the cutting edge opportunity for economic development. The days of the AT&T mothership landing in Oklahoma City or in Dallas or in Peoria, you know, we're all chasing a dwindling traditional economic development base. But there's I think approximately 40 million housing transactions expected over the next 30 to 40 years. We're in a recession, but people are still spending money, they're still going to live places. And the question is, how do we relate those opportunities to the business of planning, architecture, design? I'm a town planner. I have a small town planning firm, but we do, as Blair said, work on problem solving. And for us, problem solving is really about how you create sustained value. Whether you want to talk about these issues in terms of climate change or whatever, but that's really what we focused our practice on, and that's why Jason and I have become good friends and are beginning to work on projects together, because Jason's business, Catalyst Commercial, based out of Dallas, Jason's got a long history of doing market analysis for commercial projects, retail, hospitality, those sorts of things. But not too many retail market specialists or market analysts understand development. And almost always never understand placemaking. And so we've come together because I believe that it's not going to just happen. It's not going to just be dumb luck that you create a great place and the retail works out because you've designed a great place. And so what we want to talk to you about today is the approach that we're going to take as a team going forward in our practice, working on the opportunity to take advantage of authentic urbanism. So Jason, you might want to explain a little bit about your practice, and then I'll present a case study, and then Jason's going to talk about its performance, and then we'll talk about some lessons learned.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what makes us unique, Catalyst unique, is kind of our broad-based experience. And instead of grabbing an economist and grabbing someone from grad school that understands theory, what makes us unique is we've been actually in the field, doing the work, doing the transactions, and really working with different formats, primarily national operators, and understanding their ingredients. So kind of our team is comprised of people that have been out on the forefront, developing space, a lot for national clients such as Target, Walgreens, CVS, and Starbucks. I also have an institutional background, running a portfolio with kind of a broad base of different asset classes that had to interrelate and mix, and we were always trying to figure out how to maximize the value of the portfolio so that the pieces of the part would be synergistic with one another. We also had an opportunity to grab some corporate real estate folks from some of these brands that were making the decisions on the backside and utilizing data and trying to apply that and getting out of the theory world, but we're actually utilizing the data and their decision-making criteria. And then we also have been fortunate enough to grab some gurus that understand how to build market plans for a lot of these corporate companies. And so those guys that were building market plans for companies like Brinker and Cheddar's that are actually doing the science and understanding the consumer and where they go can actually take this information and apply it to the private and development sector. And so I think with that background being said, let me turn it back over to Scott and have him kind of work through what are the ingredients that makes a great town, or how do you make that public space work.
Great, thanks. This is a report that just came out by the Knight Foundation called the Soul of the Community Analysis, and it tells us what we've known for some time, that the success of places is driven by three basic things. Social offerings, the hangout factor, is a great nightlife. Openness, including the perceptions of a good place for older people, tolerance, racial tolerance, a place where all people feel welcome, and then of course the aesthetics of the place. And I don't believe that success comes with just two or one of the three of these categories. You really have to have all three. And I think the other opportunity is that we're in an ever-shifting environment right now. There's a lot of pain out there. There is a lot of pain. To me, this may be the most exciting time to be alive in 100 years. We're literally rewriting the rules of how we proceed. So if you want to come back over here with it, great. And so, Occupy Wall Street. Nobody's buying. I think these are opportunities, not indications of a crisis. And you're saying to yourself, what does this have to do with streets for people? Well, it really has everything to do with streets for people, because we've effectively lost the art of creating great communities. Now, if you've studied Florence, and you know that Florence is, in some regard, the result of the Medicis. They were the patrons of the high culture and investing in the art of Florence. But when they were investing in Florence, they also invested in design, but not just for culture, but also as a business. The problem is that we abandoned the notion of design as a core driver of our economy. And so our modern day patrons said that, yeah, we'll pump money into the system, but we don't care about the outcome. Because we're in the process of making sure that we securitize and resell those debt instruments, because we're more interested in making money off of selling risk than we are off of selling value. But once upon a time, it was based on value. And this is a postcard of downtown Fort Worth. You're going to have your modern streetcar. Fort Worth actually was a creature of the first ring suburbs, out the Camp Bowie corridor. The electric company sold lots to their customers, and they shot the trolley down for access to and from those neighborhoods around downtown Fort Worth. And that was a collective master developer strategy with the trolley operators, the developers, the town of Fort Worth. And they all worked together to have multiple ownership interests. But the common denominator was the design and the fabric of the places. And so this is why my thesis is that the new master developer is the form-based environment. Our traditional concept under our current zoning process is we regulate use, non-residential, subcategory convenience store, 0.2 FAR, 4 spaces per 1,000 off-street parking, and all we're left to debate at the Planning Commission meeting is the color of the sign or the buffer back to the single family, right? Because the regulation of use allows very little room for form and design. As opposed to the form-based approach, where we go back to what Blair and his colleagues at the Institute are focusing on. What's the role of design in driving the outcome and the economy, and not just the aesthetics? And so are we looking primarily at form and allowing use to be more regulated through the dynamics of the market? So I'm going to show you a process that we went through in a Main Street environment not too far away from here. This is Roanoke, Texas. This is the downtown of a small community north of Fort Worth, about 7,000 people, landlocked. It's near Alliance. When we started working for Roanoke in 2003, the only business that was really viable was Babe's Chicken House, the original, but it was doing 175,000 meals a year. Yeah, they're doing about 300,000 a year now. People wait in line for 3 hours on Saturday afternoon to eat dinner, and then they would leave because there was nothing up here in Roanoke. You know, it's in the DFW market. Fort Worth's over here. Other than Babe's, everybody in Denton County, southern Denton County, northern Tarrant County would drive down to Fort Worth or over to Dallas or maybe up to Oklahoma City to have dinner, but they certainly wouldn't hang out in Roanoke for any other reason than to get Babe's fried chicken and some chicken fried steak. This is what Main Street, which is called Oak Street, in Roanoke looked like when we started the project in 2003. You've been there, huh? Shaking your head?
I live right next to it.
Where do you live?
Flower Mound?
In Flower Mound.
I'm through there a lot.
And have you been to Roanoke lately?
Yes.
Great. Well, so you remember that this is what it looked like. By the way, so because this is a School of Architecture and Planning, so let's talk about some design issues. This right-of-way is 60 feet. The building face to building face dimension, some of the locations of the cross-section are 57, 56, 55 feet. A lot of the buildings are actually encroaching across the right-of-way line. Where do you park? Where do you walk? Where do you drive? So you can imagine just people coming to serve 175,000 minutes, that's a lot of traffic and activity. The neighborhood itself is right behind us. It's a well-established single-family neighborhood, and State Highway 377 is the block over. The driver of this opportunity is it's really adjacent to a major employment center, of course, Ross Perot Jr. and Ross Perot's in Alliance, Texas. What we did is we said, okay, what are the underlying authentic cultural and market drivers that are in place today? We were hired to do a redevelopment plan for this linear downtown. And we looked at, there was a bed and breakfast, there's the old Rock Hotel, which was originally the brothel. Bonnie of Bonnie and Clyde is from here, so they never robbed the bank in downtown Roanoke, which is now Beauty Shop, because they didn't have deposit insurance. As if you rob the bank, you rob the family, so it was interesting. But that's important. Learning the history of your location is critical to the long-term economic development opportunities in terms of placemaking. We did a market study. We estimated an absorption of a couple 100,000 square feet of additional retail restaurant. You know, you've got Trophy Club over here, Westlake, you've got Denton, you've got Keller, you've got Flower Mound, you've got Fort Worth. It's a great location in terms of market. The question is, why would anybody come here after they've gotten their full chicken and chicken fried steak? By the way, there's also Classic Cafe right over here, which is a 4-star restaurant that people did and still do come from miles around. Classic Cafe, Babes, City Hall, a little strip commercial on 377. You can see the black buildings and the figure around. That was it. We did a market study and a master plan based on what we thought could be absorbed. Not designed for design's sake, but you can see the beige buildings, the infill with some very careful public spaces, a future plaza down here. We found a right-of-way that had been taken over by the property owners and the street never came through. So that was an opportunity for a linear plaza. So then what we did is we took this master plan and we wrote a form-based code. And the purpose of this presentation is not to get into the details of the form-based code. This is actually the early one. We rezoned and there's a new zoning exhibit, which is the essential key component of the form-based code. But this is in an infill environment. When we write our form-based codes, and we've done smart codes and we do a number of different types, we fit the code for the particular project. But we felt that the characteristics of Oak Street and the characteristics of each of the intersecting side streets going into the neighborhoods and over to 377 were so critical that we locked in the public works design requirements. In other words, we locked in at the city-initiated rezoning of all these parcels what the cross-sections of these streets would look like as they were reconstructed. We didn't wait for that to be decided in a vacuum as an afterthought by the Public Works and Engineering Department. We involved them in our process. We got the correct design so that the transitions, the parking, and the relationships of all of the streets within a network that influenced the corridor was worked out at zoning. Why? Because the form-based approach creates a master developer context. Every individual owner can benefit from the city acting as the overall master developer, essentially. And you don't have to own the entire downtown to get the benefit of that context. We did an analysis that Jason's going to talk about in a sec in terms of the baseline in 2004, 2005, in terms of the residential, retail, office, and then two growth scenarios under this redevelopment strategy. And we estimated the amount of taxes that would be generated from this development to help pay for infrastructure to implement the vision of this master plan. So we did a city-initiated rezoning. We worked with the property owners that were afraid that this was government doing something to them. We said, oh no, this is government spending money to create value at government expense. We created an opportunity for mixed use. You couldn't do residential along Oak Street. We created it as a matter of right, either above or behind the storefront buildings. We went through a process of determining historically what the building height should be in certain locations. We limited it to 2 stories in that 4 or 5 block historic stretch. But most importantly, we actually designed the functional and aesthetic aspects of reinventing Oak Street in our master plan. You can see it here. And Half and Associates was hired to do a final design and they carried through our master plan. We then came back in when half was redesigning for reconstruction to implement the vision of this redone Oak Street, and we met with every property owner as they were completing their construction drawings to make sure that the street tree placements, the ADA elements, all of those things, if there was an encroachment over the right-of-way line, fine, grandfathered. If the front porch of Babes had old farm implement seats for people to wait and that was in the right-of-way, fine. Okay, but we had to design it so that at the end of the day, it wasn't some engineers, and many of my good friends are engineers and I do highway work too, but it wasn't somebody in a black box in an office either 3 cities or 3 states away doing a typical cross-section all the way down. Because how do you do a typical cross-section for this kind of roadway? Plus we had to figure out a way to deal with the overhead utility lines. Thank God there were alleys. We did an analysis of burying them, too expensive, but we moved them to the alleys. We convinced the city council that that was a critical investment. Why? Because it's such a narrow right-of-way that the conflicts of trying to get parking, pedestrian activity, storefronts, and traffic all in one place, it was worth the extra $3 million for 3/4 of a mile to move them to the alleys. So this was the cross-section 2003. Here it is last year. And what's amazing about this is that it's not urban renewal. This is the mayor's dad's car wash. That's the mayor's dad's car wash. We grandfathered it form-based. At the time when we did this, the mayor's dad told us that he was definitely going to bury us if we thought these smart consultants were going to come in town. And he also has an auto repair deal down here. So we calibrated the code so that if you have a non-conforming building, not a non-conforming use, but the building's set back too far, or the facade is all solid, there isn't, the fenestration, to use your architectural term, there is none. As long as you keep your business going and you don't invest over a certain threshold, you can stay in business in perpetuity forever. Don't empty out buildings in the name of progress. Non-conforming buildings are much better in terms of growing value and let it evolve in long-term investment. Today we have 4 more buildings under construction. About 7 up until last year were constructed. We have multiple new restaurants. And this doesn't even do it justice. If you come down here on Thursday, Friday, or Saturday night, it's a real downtown. And so the technical aspects of what I just described are the what and the how. But when you're doing your work, whether you're an architect, or an investor, a developer, a finance person, a mayor, an activist, ask yourself, why are you doing this? Why is the street going to be designed the way it is? Why is it not working today the way it should? And even if you're constrained with 60 feet of right-of-way, what is it that you can do? Today, Roanoke brands themselves the unique diamond capital of Texas, and they are rocking. Just in 6 short years, through a design process that harnessed the pent-up demand of the region for authentic restaurants and a place to hang out without having to drive 30 miles to downtown Fort Worth or downtown Dallas. It made all the difference in the world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason, and he's going to tell you about what the results were. Let me just tease this up with one thing. We did not create a tax increment financing district because we didn't think that the tax base, the property tax and sales tax that would be thrown off from the increased increment, the increased value, would be sufficient to pay for the almost $10 million it took to redo Oak Street for less than a mile. I think Jason's going to show you that actually we might see a payback in less than 10 years.
So the first 2 slides, the baseline was where it was, kind of prior 2003, and then there was a couple of scenarios that they ran out based on their market analysis. Just currently today, in the last few years, there's about 210,000 square feet. Most of that's commercial and mostly restaurant-based. I think there was certainly a story there. But if you look at the current annual net fiscal impacts, you're looking at about $250,000, which is already exceeding the scenario 1 and 2 plans substantially, and generally that's based on just the restaurant sales alone.
Those scenarios were probably based on a 20-year time horizon.
Right. So if you want to look at the true net value, you've got about 50,000 square feet of commercial space, so they haven't even added the incremental office or residential into this. Currently, the restaurants, and this is kind of an average, we've interviewed several of the restaurants, and some of those operators are doing 400 or 500 a square foot in sales. But if you average those in, they're doing about $12.5 million in gross net additional sales to the area, which gives the city that $250,000 a year sales tax. Based on where they are in the market demand, and obviously success breeds success. I think they'll see the payback and the $10.5 million of investment probably within that 10-year period, and they're having a growth rate currently of about 10 to 20% of increased tax base just because of the success of the project, and a lot of that does have to do with the design and the function of the space. So if you want to look at where Roanoke was as a baseline, this kind of even goes back pre-2003. They had about $828,000 in sales tax. If you look at the baseline of $1,124,000 in 2003, you can look at the 2010 numbers that were published. About $3.9 million of sales tax attributed. About 20% of the sales tax are generated are from or derived from the Oak Street project. The remainder of the commercial space, there's some anchors that have landed, Walmart and some other projects that make up the delta between those two numbers. But if you can look at the sales tax increase, you get a little bit of sales tax fall just during the recession years. But again, they're going to see a quick recovery in that. And surprisingly, the property tax rate's been extremely stable. But for one reason, they've been able to grow the sales tax by adding that commercial space. So, if you want to get into how does that work or how do you start programming space, this is really how, and I think it's appropriate to understand how some of these retail operators are starting to underwrite the space and how do they make the decisions of going to Roanoke versus going to Norman or Edmond or Oklahoma City. And so this is kind of the paradigm shift that's occurring over the last 10 to 15 years. Retailers are getting extremely smart on understanding who their consumers is and understanding the demand requirements in order for them to be successful. One of the most exciting things with some of the national brands, which tend to be not that exciting because most of the locations are somewhat incremental in the enterprise value, is that most of the stores are able to predict their performance within plus or minus 3% before they even open the doors, based on understanding the market factors and forces that are around that area, and being able to do an analog or comparison of other units and understanding the capture rates that most of these national operators truly know when they choose a location what the performance of that location is going to be. So Panera's kind of evolved over the last few years. They've been kind of reformatting their market plan and figuring things out and adopting some of this customer data. So after they've had a chance to kind of work through trial and error, they start to get kind of a very predictable consumer base. So they've gone between maybe a 10 or 15% swag in what they think they might do in performance down to kind of tighten up within that 4 or 5% band with a few number of units. So you have to understand how some of these operators are choosing the locations before you get involved in programming out the space and actually understanding how to quantify that demand and how to apply certain uses. Understanding the demand is actually very simple. We look at 4 inputs. These are traditionally the only 4 inputs that you really need to understand. We look at the firmographic inputs, and if you, as Scott mentioned early on, where the drivers are coming from, Roanoke, it's primarily firmographic, or that workforce, that daytime environment. It's all those businesses in the alliance that needed a place to eat during lunch or after dinner drinks. So we want to understand the employment numbers, the pay scales, where they are, and what sort of capture rate we might be able to get from that workforce. The other thing that we do, we look at commuter and pedestrian traffic, interstates and side streets and arterial thoroughfares. Generally, there's a relationship between traffic and sales, and if you can understand the trips that are generated, then you can start to understand some sort of capture rate. But generally, we can see that there's about a 3 to 5% capture rate along interstates and along those arterial thoroughfares that might be able to be applied to some of these areas. And a lot of times overlooked are visitor economies, where you can have certain trips generated, but certainly not as sustainable as some of these other bases, but certainly as you get into stadiums or entertainment districts, then that visitor economy can become very important to that overall economy of the region. And then last is obviously residential. That's going to comprise most of the time 80% of your market demand or the feed demand. But kind of a unique project where we're looking at, we have 3% residential, and all the other demands coming from basically firmographic, to some degree visitor traffic or commuter traffic. And that's we're doing all the land planning or market analysis for DFW Airport where there is no residential base. So we're having to understand the passengers and the rent-a-car customers and the commuter traffic to really start to extract some of the demand and what is the viability of certain commercial uses along 8,000 acres within the DFW Airport. So what does that process look like before you start to get into designing and programming areas? Is, what is the study area? Where is the area that you can make the biggest impact? What is the internal geography of that revitalization zone, or if it's a single asset entity, what are the boundaries of that property? Then we look at how to define the geography or where the consumer is going to come from. So you start to look at all these independent inputs, which kind of starts to formulate that market analysis or the summary of demand where these inputs are coming from. And so we start to quantify the demand drivers of firmographic or commuter. And then you get, the next part is really starting to look at the individual property analysis. Each individual property is going to have zoning ordinances or maybe public constraints or physical constraints. And so you need to understand the physical environment of what you're working with. It's not necessarily what the overall region will support. Some areas certainly physically couldn't support an IKEA. In some areas that might be 20 or 30 acres, you could start applying some of those larger uses. And then we get into tenant profiling. So if retailers understand who their consumer is, and then that's predictive, then certainly you can take the same analog or the methodology and start to become very predictive on the types of tenants. Even if you understand the demand in certain categorical uses that start to make sense, then you can actually start programming individual tenants in these space and become more proactive, which we tend to do rather than being reactive and waiting for the market to catch up. And the last phase of this would be doing the implementation or getting the babes and getting some of these uses on board so you can create that value. So this is an example of how to understand the geography. A lot of what we do, we want to understand where their customer base is coming from. So these are actually license plates of customers that were shopping at a Walmart. But we've done the same thing, and very interesting, the difference in geography between how Norman trades and how Quail Springs and how Edmond trades and how all those interrelate and how competitive Moore is versus Norman. Where some consumers might bypass Norman to go to Moore for certain goods and services and vice versa. There's a lot of trade-offs that you have to really take into consideration as you start to program the space and understand what the true market demand is. So once you understand the geography, then you can start looking at the psychographic or the cultural identification of some of these consumers and then the demographic value of some of the consumers, so then you can start applying some of these metrics to some of the areas that you quantify the type of space that makes the most sense. So as you understand these inputs and start to quantify demand, then you can start applying them to the physical space and engaging Scott and guys like Scott to really plan through the space very smartly and then identify where the public policy might need to shift or how to develop that infrastructure. So if you want to get involved in maybe kind of the push.
Yeah, we've got one more case study. They're two related case studies, and then we'll open up for a conversation. It's interesting. Roanoke, I think, was, we did a very basic market analysis. We didn't do a sophisticated retail analysis like Jason just described for Roanoke. But I do think what we want to do is have Jason analyze the performance as he showed you after the fact and why did it play out the way it played out. And I want to be very clear about something. The restaurants that are coming into Roanoke are not mom and pop restaurants. They're regional franchises, Gerhard's, Cowboy Chow, but they function and feel like good, local, authentic mom and pop restaurants. But the science of figuring out what your retail opportunities are, your commercial opportunities, doesn't just fall into place because you've got great design. I think that's the point we're trying to make. And so Jason's walking you through that basic science, I think is important to understand. You should use Jason when you need him, but sometimes there's just so much pent-up demand. And I think what happens is within metro regions like Oklahoma City or Dallas-Fort Worth, there are smaller communities that don't realize they have it. But you still have to analyze it and understand it, regardless of whether you use professional consultants or whether you use your own judgment and put together those pieces. Let me show you real quickly another example of in a greenfield or Class A environment, meaning top rents, where the same dynamic can be utilized from a planning perspective, and then Jason's going to show how that actually played out in a similar project. This is the intersection of Central Expressway, the President George Bush, and the dark red line. Some of you may be familiar with this. Here's the President George Bush. Here's Central Expressway. This is the dark red line station that's in the field here in the southeast corner. This is Plano, this is Richardson. My clients bought this 200 acres, the last remaining infill property in Richardson. The 57 acres here and the 50 acres still owned by the Cruz. They hired an architecture firm, they hired our planning firm. We designed it in concert, not as competitors, but as a complementary opportunity. And then we zoned all of it on behalf of both property owners form-based. The reason I'm showing you this is to show you even a great location. If it doesn't have the right regulatory implementation tools available to it, nothing happens. For years, this great location sat dormant because it was at a competitive disadvantage relative to where the market was headed. Conventional zoning, campus commercial, campus office, apartments, light industrial. That's a mismatch for this location. There's a dark rail line that takes you up to downtown Plano and Mockingbird Station where he offices there. And so the owners couldn't get the value that they believed it was worth because there was a mismatch. We went through a planning process. I'm not going to go through the details, but here's the existing platform. You know, very large, tall office buildings, but in an urban context, maybe a hotel. Coming down, this is a beautiful tree that's in the middle of this field, so we've got this nice stroke down to this plaza, and it can transition quickly into this townhome enclave to bring a neighborhood feel into this 57 acres. You're looking at about 5 million square feet on 57 acres. We went through a form-based zoning process, and without going into the details though, back to the theme of streets for people. This is actually in the zoning ordinance. We literally keyed every street, and some of them, by the way, the dash streets, are illustrative connections that have to be made through some means. It's not exact in terms of the requirement for that location. Some of the solid streets are exact streets because we're getting some urban design set to create real value so that if part of this property is sold off, it still functions in a master developed environment because it's operating under related similar rules. So that when you have investment here and value driven here through buildings and public spaces, it increases the value here as opposed to decreasing it because you're operating in a consistent set of rules. Not one size fits all, different rules for the different locations. But we key at zoning. We don't wait for subdivision. We key the design. So this TOD street type A is for all of these solid red line streets. And so we are matching up the function of the streets in terms of lane widths. You know, I showed you Infocom, there's a cycle track here. So that the function of the street marries up with, and then the rest of the code, if you have a parcel in this area, this is the plan view of the TOD code area that shows you where the building disposition is on the block, the relationship of the sidewalks, and then the private frontage, how it relates to the public frontage, is all done at zoning. This is embedding future value. This is actually pre-developing the project. It's taking zoning closer to the development stage so that there's an execution that drives value going forward. But the point I want to ultimately make is, everybody keeps saying ground level retail. The city wanted ultimately for us to cap the number of multifamily units. We don't want those people. And what we said was, you can't put enough multifamily or urban residential on this site to drive the non-residential. It's regional. It will take hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of houses, the 80% of the driver, to take advantage of this kind of density and location. So what we did is we said on the main street going to the platform and going over to the other property, no residential uses on the first 30 feet. We didn't say mandatory retail. We just don't want that shop front to have conflicts with residential uses. And then on the other frontages along this major road and this type A street with the blue, we said that ground floor needs to be built to retail ready standards, not retail required. A 15-foot floor clear to clear, which is probably going to be a concrete podium construction, commercial building code and commercial ADA standards. You can put residential in these buildings on the ground floor, but the cost structure per door of the rents required to pay for that building type are going to be so high that you're not going to have a developer spec build 2,000 units of residential. They're going to incrementally build and tenant each building and pre-lease it up. And so this is a market-based way to hold the ultimate long-term mix without micromanaging at the Planning Commission. The reason I'm showing you this is that it can be done on a multi-sale basis. This can be sold off in parcel lines. That project is still greenfield, it hasn't been built. That project sets up the Roanoke dynamic, small incremental development and Main Street environments in a Class A environment. Jason worked on the tenant mix and the merchandising of a mixed-use building in downtown Dallas, One Arts, and he wants to explain how that was done in this project. So I want to show you kind of the planning side of this kind of Class A environment, and now Jason is going to show you how they actually deployed it. Hopefully someday we can have a case study on what happened at Bush Central. So, and I hope you get that merchandising contract.
And a couple more slides left, so we'll open it up to questions. But I think this is a great example, which actually could be applied very well to Roanoke, because you've got kind of a fixed area. And the way that we wanted to approach the merchandising was, in essence, that, the condos in the office was fairly fixed. Most of the office was pre-committed with Thompson and Knight and 7-Eleven moving their headquarters. So that certainly reduced a lot of risk of the building. Most of the condos were pre-sold. The last 50%, in essence, made it over the mark once we started getting the project underway. It took about 12 to 18 months to stabilize that, and then there was some private investment that went on to get the permanent financing locked up. But I think the most interesting thing, or what could be applied, would be this first floor level of the plaza, which has a lot of congruencies with Roanoke. And the challenge was we saw what was going on in downtown, which was still going through a revitalization, but most of the area was focused with national chains, and the sales per square foot wasn't hitting its metrics. So we went out and actually found these individual, unique kind of boutique operators that had already proved themselves. So Taeon was an operator already in Uptown that he went and studied how to make soba noodles for 6 months and came back and opened up Taeon, very proven operator. 7-Eleven obviously was a no-brainer. We had to give them some sort of commitment of the space since they were upstairs as kind of a test model of this urban format they were proving up. The commissary was actually a replacement tenant for a wine bar called Dolly. So we've had some replacements there, but Tassar worked at a lot of the famous restaurants downtown, including the Mansion. Jorge's was actually a staple out of Midland, and also if you've gone to UT, those that have, you'll recognize the Jorge's name. Fedora was a kind of a spin-off of Campisi. If you've ever been to Dallas and had Campisi's Pizza, this was Gina Campisi's concept. And then Screen Door was actually kind of a response to an area in Oak Cliff that one of their competitors had opened up Hattie's, and so this was his response to Hattie's, kind of the southern cuisine, and he was trying to, in essence, kind of recreate an opportunity. But the unique thing is these aren't national chains other than 7-Eleven. Most of you may not recognize kind of the history, but we wanted to go out and get successful operators that wanted to reinvent themselves and do it in a space that we felt like the metrics or the demand was there. Since opening the plaza, other than the one re-tenant, currently now all these operators are doing greater than $800 a square foot in sales. Most of the operators here in Dallas, if you want to try to get some sort of baseline, would do somewhere 300 at the low end, 200 to 300 on the low end to maybe 500. So this is way above market average, but this is a classic example of a single asset space versus a multi-asset space that could correlate very well with kind of that same challenge that Roanoke had, that still evolving markets. So
I want to add something. We had Hans invited us in. We had a really good conversation. Several of you were here with his architecture class and looking at the relationship of master planning and architecture and programming. It's interesting. Again, don't be stuck in the bucket or the specialization. Lucy Billingsley, when Jason was working for Billingsley, had Jason do the tenant mix, and they went out and recruited the appropriate businesses and put them together with a strategy. The person that's quarterbacking in Roanoke, the tenant mix there, effectively is the city manager, right. Jimmy Statatos. I mean, he really is. It's a small enough environment with enough momentum as a effectively singularly organized mall environment with restaurants that people come to him and they say, well, we want to come into downtown Roanoke, and Jimmy's basically going, well, you need to talk to this restaurateur, would you be better over here, this building's available. And so I think the lesson here is not necessarily who does it, but that it gets done. And downtown redevelopment or corridor redevelopment, I think the lesson is, it doesn't just happen because you did a great master plan. You know, those of us that do the design work and get the infrastructure paid for and get it on the ground are still going to have some empty buildings and a lot of expensive infrastructure if we don't either directly or indirectly facilitate that next step that we've talked about.
And I guess on the economic side, I'd probably add also that, you know, the city put in $10.5 million at risk on, you know, basically public improvements or community development in order to reduce that, even though there was already kind of a proven market operator base. And even above and beyond that, there was a lot of no interest, you know, kind of forgivable loans if they ended up making their metrics. So it wasn't like the market was there and it just came and the plan was in place. So, I mean, in essence, the city really had to, you know, participate. And I'll go back to Roanoke and give you some examples, but most of those, you know, the first 3 operators we almost owned. You know, there wasn't a lot of private equity. They were having a hard time syndicating the equity required to put the investment in the restaurants. So we became their investment partner.
Talk about One Arts.
One Arts, yeah, we ended up putting them in business, which is very similar to what the public sector did
With the investment.
on Roanoke. We invested in the majority of those restaurants and then got a fairly high amount of percentage rent. But we were, I guess, comfortable enough with the operators that we were willing to make that risk and make the risk and investment. But we knew we had to catalyze those with the space with the right operators, or we would have never been able to balance the rest out. Now, you know, 3 years later, everybody's made whole, or, you know, they're in essence paying a, you know, market rent or above market rent based on that. But, you know, both instances, there was a lot of risk involved with the developer or the public sector in order to get kind of to that tipping point. So.
Well, what I'm hearing is happening here with your MAPS initiative, your MAPS 3 initiative from Blair and Hope and Professor Goins and Shane in our conversations today is that, you know, there's a bit of a void that the Institute is filling. Hanser class is doing this. You know, there's going to be a large infrastructure investment in downtown going forward. What are you going to do with that investment? What's it going to result in? How's it going to be leveraged? What are going to be the drivers of the private sector plug into that socket? So we'll leave you with that thought and answer any questions or any comments. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Sure.